The certified letter was waiting on my own kitchen counter when I got home from my night shift, addressed to me, stamped with the logo of a bank I had never once done business with in my life. And by the time I finished reading the first paragraph, my hands were shaking hard enough that I had to set it down on the counter to keep reading. Notice of default. Notice of intent to foreclose. A home equity line of credit, opened 4 years earlier, secured against a house that had been paid off in full since before I was even born, a house that belonged entirely to me, and a balance of $41,000 that I had never borrowed, never signed for, and never once heard mentioned in my own kitchen until the exact moment a bank's legal department decided it was time to take my home away from me to collect it. My name is Rachel. I'm 29 years old, and the house this letter concerned had belonged to my grandfather, a quiet, careful man who built it with his own hands in 1974 and left it to me outright when he passed 6 years ago. The deed transferring cleanly into my name with no mortgage attached, because my grandfather believed a house should never owe anybody anything by the time you handed it down. I was 23 when I inherited it, working 2 jobs and finishing my nursing degree at night, and my parents, Robert and Linda, asked almost immediately whether they could move in with me, citing my father's recent layoff and the impossible rent increases hitting their old apartment complex. I said yes without a second thought, because that's what you do for your parents, and because the house had 3 empty bedrooms my grandfather had once hoped to fill with grandchildren visiting on weekends. What I didn't fully understand at 23, and what took me 6 painful years to finally see clearly, was that my father had never actually stopped being on my grandfather's paperwork the way he should have. Years earlier, before I'd even graduated high school, my grandfather had granted my father limited power of attorney to help manage his affairs during a health scare. Paperwork that should have expired automatically once my grandfather recovered, and certainly should have been revoked entirely the moment the house transferred into my name. But somewhere in the shuffle of grief and probate and moving boxes after the funeral, that old power of attorney document was never formally terminated, sitting quietly in a file at the county recorder's office. An old key nobody remembered still fit the lock, and my father, whether by accident or by design, had known exactly where that key was the entire time. The rent conversation happened about a year into them living with me, delivered by my father at the kitchen table in the same reasonable, fatherly tone he'd used my entire childhood to explain why I couldn't have something I wanted. He said that since he and my mother were contributing so much to the household, cooking, cleaning, keeping the place up, while I worked long hospital shifts, it only made sense that I contribute financially too, $700 a month, to cover what he called our shared cost of living. He said it the way he used to explain why I couldn't have the bicycle I wanted at 10 years old, calm, patient, faintly disappointed in me for even needing the explanation in the first place. I remember sitting there doing the math in my head, the same disorienting math I'd do for years afterward, the numbers refusing to make sense no matter how many times I ran them, because there was no mortgage on this house, no rent owed to anyone. Nothing to split except utilities I was already paying half of. But my father had a gift, one I only recognized fully once it was too late to matter. For making the irrational sound perfectly reasonable if he said it calmly enough and let a silence stretch afterward long enough to make you doubt your own math instead of his logic. I paid it. $700 a month for 3 years, into an account my father managed, money that came directly out of my nursing salary while I lived in a house that belonged, on every legal document that existed, entirely to me. My mother would occasionally look uncomfortable during these conversations, would sometimes catch my eye across the table like she wanted to say something, but she never did, and I understand now that her silence was its own kind of complicity. The quiet cooperation of someone who benefited from an arrangement she knew wasn't right but wasn't willing to risk her own comfort to correct. I found out about the home equity line of credit entirely by accident, the way these things always seem to surface, when a coworker mentioned she'd used a similar loan product against her own house and asked, casually, how my interest rate compared to hers. I told her I didn't have one. She looked confused, said she was sure she'd seen my address come up in a title search database she used for a completely unrelated reason at her second job doing paralegal work for a real estate attorney, and that it showed an active lien from 4 years back. I laughed it off in the moment, certain there was some clerical error, some mixed-up parcel number, and then I went home that night and pulled my own credit report for the first time in years, something I'm embarrassed to admit I'd never bothered doing regularly. And there it was in black and white, a home equity line of credit opened in my name, using my grandfather's old power of attorney paperwork for years earlier, 6 months after they'd moved in with me, a full year before the rent. Conversation had even happened. I confronted my father that same night, laying the credit report on the kitchen table between us, and I watched him do something I will never forget for the rest of my life. He didn't deny it. He didn't even really try to explain it away with the smooth, reasonable tone he'd perfected over decades. He simply sighed, the sigh of a man being mildly inconvenienced rather than caught in a fraud that could send him to prison, and said that the business venture he'd invested the money in, some contracting equipment scheme with an old friend, had not worked out the way he'd hoped, and that he'd been meaning to tell me once things stabilized, once he found a way to pay it back without worrying me. My mother sat at the far end of the table during this entire conversation, staring at her hands, and when I finally turned to her and asked if she'd known, she nodded, just slightly, unable to meet my eyes, and said she'd told him years ago it wasn't right, but that he'd assured her he had it under control. I asked her why she'd never once mentioned it to me directly in 4 years of watching me hand my father $700 a month for rent on my own house, while he quietly used the property as collateral behind my back. She didn't have an answer for that one either, just more silence, the same silence she'd used at every dinner table conversation where I now understood she'd known exactly what was happening and chosen comfort over honesty. I asked my father how he had even gotten a bank to approve a loan using paperwork that should have expired years earlier. He said the paperwork technically never specified an expiration date, that his lawyer friend had told him it was a gray area, and that he genuinely hadn't thought it would cause any real problem since he fully intended to pay it back before it ever came to this. He had not paid it back. Not one payment, not once, in 4 years, and the account had gone from delinquent to default to the desk of a bank's foreclosure department, which is how a certified letter addressed to me ended up on my kitchen counter informing me that the house my grandfather built with his own hands, the house he'd worked his entire life to hand down debt-free, was now $41,000 in the hole and sliding toward a foreclosure auction because of a loan I never took out, never saw a dollar of, and never once agreed to. I hired a real estate attorney within the week, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Patricia who specialized in exactly this kind of family financial exploitation far more often than either of us wished was necessary in her line of work. She pulled the original power of attorney document from the county archive herself within 2 days, read through it twice, and told me plainly that any competent judge would see it for what it was, an expired instrument my father had continued to exploit years after it should have died with the circumstances that created it. She explained that because the power of attorney had technically already been superseded by the property transfer into my name, there was a strong legal argument that the loan itself was fraudulent and potentially voidable, but that fighting it through the courts to void it entirely could take months, possibly longer, time the bank's foreclosure timeline wouldn't necessarily wait for. In the meantime, to stop the immediate bleeding and protect the roof over my head, I needed to either negotiate directly with the bank or pay down the debt enough to bring the account current while the fraud case moved through the system separately. I drained nearly every dollar I'd saved toward nursing school loan payoff and a future down payment on a car, almost $30,000, to bring that account current and buy myself room to fight the rest of it properly. Money that existed because I'd worked double shifts for years while also paying my own father rent to live in the house he was simultaneously mortgaging out from under me without my knowledge. The eviction notice that followed a month later wasn't from the bank. It was from me, filed the same week Patricia successfully got the fraudulent portion of the loan formally voided by the court. Once the paperwork trail made clear my father had used an expired power of attorney to encumber a property he had no legal claim to, I sat with that court order in my hands longer than I probably needed to before I called the sheriff's office to schedule the formal eviction, because some small, stubborn part of me kept hoping my father would say something, anything. That sounded like real remorse instead of irritation at the inconvenience I was apparently causing him by objecting to being defrauded in my own home. He never did. He told me, right up until the deputy served the papers, that I was blowing this out of proportion, that families work these things out, that I should be grateful he'd never actually let the house go to auction. As though narrowly avoiding the full consequences of his fraud was itself an act of parental protection I owed him gratitude for. My parents moved in with my mother's sister 2 states away, and the calls since have been infrequent, my father's messages alternating between wounded silence and brief attempts to reframe the entire situation as an overreaction on my part. My mother occasionally texting alone, quiet apologies that never quite specify what exactly she's apologizing for. My aunt, my mother's sister, called me once, quietly, a few weeks after they arrived, and told me she'd suspected for years that something wasn't right about how comfortable my father always seemed despite never quite having steady work, and that she was sorry it took a foreclosure notice for the rest of us to see it clearly enough to act. I live in my grandfather's house alone now, the fraudulent debt fully voided by the court, the deed clean, the mail delivered to a box only I check, and every account tied to that property now carrying a password only I know. I planted tomatoes last spring in the exact spot my grandfather used to grow them, something I remembered from being a small child following him around that yard with a plastic watering can far too big for my hands, and I think about him often now. Grateful in a way that still catches in my throat sometimes, that a man who spent his whole life making sure this house would never owe anyone anything left it to the one grandchild who'd eventually have to fight her own father to make that true. Again. Some nights I sit on the back porch he built with his own hands and think about how close I came to losing the only piece of him I had left, and how strange it is that the person who nearly cost me everything shares my last name, while the man who actually protected it has been gone for 6 years and still somehow manages to, through nothing more than the house he left behind.